one's racial identity no longer predicted how one fares, in reality, statistical analysis often reveals that racial identity is a measurable, significant, and persistent predictor of labor market outcomes. You might also be wondering what this has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. That illustrates the many facets that fall under the umbrella of DEI. This should come as no surprise when we consider the origins of race as a social construct, the racial disparities we observe across any number of economic outcomes. We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to be illuminating. I am looking forward to all of you meeting my guests today. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions from our audience. This takes a great deal of effort to pull off. So I am eternally grateful to all of my loyal guests. Every week we create new content and looking forward to subscribing to our YouTube channel to keep up with us. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for a living, I help thought-provoking leaders implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets. Thank you today for joining us as we continue to share the different voices in the DEI space. Today, we have two amazing influencers. Tammy is the founder and CEO of PCQ Consulting, and she consults with domestic and international companies to help them improve their culture and develop sustainable DEI initiatives driven first by the culture that supports diverse candidates. Tammy has worked primarily in the healthcare space before starting her own company in 2019. Her passions include people's work and sustainable fashion. When she is not helping people be their best selves in the workplace, she is helping them discover their styles and what they want their style to say about them in and outside the workplace. Another trailblazer, Nikki Lanier, is the CEO of Harper Slade, a racial equity advisory firm focused on helping organizations advance equity for some and equality for all. Nikki is a dexterous division executive, having led teams in several settings, including manufacturing, government, higher education, HR consulting, healthcare, K-12, and central banking. Nikki earned a Juris Doctor from the University of Miami School of Law, a bachelor's degree in journalism from Hampton University, and holds a certification in collective bargaining from Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. In addition, she has served as an adjunct MBA professor for the University of Louisville College of Business, where she also serves on its board of advisors. We are going to welcome the ladies. Thank you so much for tuning in. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm so honored to be here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. We are so excited to have this conversation, and we're going to jump right into it. What do you think are the three biggest challenges, Nikki, today regarding racial equity?
I think the overarching challenge with racial equity en masse, I mean, that's inside of work and all the other many systems in which this work must advance, is that we have never, ever seen what we are purporting to have employers and organizations embrace. That is this idea of race being equal, the presumption of humanity, the presumption of mattering without context and without asterisk, without footnote and without parentheses is an entirely uncommon reality that our world has never faced. Black and brown citizens have always had to claw our way to marginal mattering, contextual mattering. And so this idea of kind of blanket racial equity, that is the parity and kind of amplified equality of people of color is just unprecedented. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is that it is entirely counterculture and there is no real roadmap for it. It's hard for people to vision it. The second issue is, because of that, we tend to assign so many definitions to it, in the same way that we've done with diversity. We assign so many definitions to it that we spend a lot of time kind of stewing and spiraling around and how best to define it, that we never really get to the real work. And the third, at least from my view and in my practice, is that we don't understand the economic imperative associated with continuing to be bad at it, continuing to not really, in a fulsome way, address the realities and the constraints that have come with the cumulative muting and stunting and marginalization of people of color that now presents itself as an economic issue that the entire country has to reckon with.
I like that you said that there's no real definition, right? Like when you say you do DEI, each of us who do this work will have a different idea about what that is.
Right.
And I said something similar today, that that's why I think racism is so hard to wrap our arms around, because if you ask each of us, what is racism? Whether you're a Black person, or a brown person, or a white person, we're all going to have a different definition outside of what the Webster definition said. If we all said, tell me a racist act, we will all have different ideas of what is and is not a racist act. So we're trying to solve this big problem, and none of us can agree on what the answer is to the problem. And so I find that's probably one of the hardest things that we have to contend with as DEI strategists. So I'm curious that, as a person who does this work, have you developed tools that helps company kind of bridge this racial inequity divide within their organization, to help them kind of bridge that gap of why there aren't more Black and brown people within the workspace?
Tools. So I think, so my practice is fairly unique in that I'm not necessarily focused on the doing, the stuff and things of racial equity. I'm really interested in the conditions that give rise to incubating a new belief system around amplifying people of color, that then flowing from that, there's new thinking that helps to protect this new belief system, and then the stuff and things and the doing. So in terms of the tools, I think it's important that for the very first thing that any organization, any leader should embark on, is a full examination of your current state belief system related to this work, because the activities, the stuff and things of it, really is not effectual. There's no permanency to that. And there's no overarching economic, workforce development, social justice related sustainable changes that come from that. Rather, I think we have to get to the heart and mind of the work. It is the harder work. So I spend a lot of time helping employers unpack what's the current social norms that are currently in place in your workplace, what's already here that is thwarting even the most sincere, the most earnest efforts around DEI. How do you start thinking about your own relationship with race and racism? Where did that come from? And why must we jettison some of that thinking, or recast a new way of thinking about that thinking, in order to start incubating new belief systems that help us understand how we find permanency in this work? So there's, lots of engagement tools, if you will, that I employ as a part of that. Lots of programs and immersions that I try to help employers better experience, so that they understand how to think about readying themselves to cultivate an environment for this kind of thriving.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that is the tool that you want to use, right? That recasting the way people think, because that's the hardest part of this work. You can get to the stuffing part later. We can put in policies and practices and procedures. But if I don't get into why you think the way you think, why you believe the way you believe, why your leaders think the way they do, then we're just doing the fluff work that doesn't change anything. And when I leave, when you leave, everything goes right back to what it was, because we haven't dealt with why these thoughts exist, why these behaviors exist, how many of these behaviors are conscious and unconscious, and just really digging into the behaviors and the thought process of why people believe what they believe. So I love that is your tool. Let's sit down and engage these thoughts, more so than me coming in and creating this manual for you or this checklist for you. I mean, that's helpful. I'm not saying, and none of these are very helpful, but I think most of what DEI is about really engaging people in debate, conversation, and thought, and challenging people. And it's okay to be challenged and be uncomfortable. That's how we grow, but in a way that allows people to be uncomfortable, but come back into the conversation with us. Because if I get you too uncomfortable, then you may be in the room with me, but you're not in that conversation with me anymore.
Yeah. And I think that's why the why and the how matter so much for me,
Right.
maybe even more than the what. So I think, we have to be really careful that there's a lot of delicacy that's associated with this. I mean, we have to be delicate with where people are, because none of us are the architects of what we are now looking to dismantle. We all inherited it. Some of us enable it more than we know. But we didn't create it. So we have to be careful with messages that feel like they're laced with guilt and anger and venom, because again, not effectual. Not effectual. People have come to where they are, and their understanding of race and mattering and contextualizing all of that. This is hundreds of years in the making of this kind of thinking, and it's not just white people that think that. I mean, we all do. Several of us. I know, even I.
Yes.
As a Black woman with amazing confidence, have to battle back messages around my own something that the world keeps sending to me. So I think that's really important. And then also the pacing and the sequencing of the work, the pacing and the sequencing of the work, so that we're really thoughtful about how to effect demonstrable real change for generations to come.
Right.
Love it.
Yeah, me too. It's interesting. We mentioned and we touched upon it about unconscious biases. And I think I strongly believe and fundamentally agree with both of you that that's where it comes from. And if we're not addressing the unconscious biases, then, like you said, Tammy, the policies and procedures and the manuals won't help, because then it becomes robotic and it's not a cultural mindset that you're instilling within yourself and towards the other lead and with the other leaders.
That's right. That's right. We have to really be careful with that. And just again, grace is kind of the word that I've used to describe my practice, and I hope that describes my behaviors as I practice in this practice. But I think that's so very important. It took us 400 years plus to get to this point, and it's not going to change overnight. But we do the acceleration, even in the midst of that grace giving. Is still important, just given the demography, just given the realities of the demography that we're facing.
Yeah,
Right.
I think we don't want to get stuck in grace and don't move people beyond grace. And I think sometimes we put our foot on the gas too far ahead and you kind of jerk people. And sometimes we don't put enough of our feet on the gas to move people along. So it's finding that gentle balance between grace and now we're moving. Grace and now we're moving. Grace and now we're moving, to keep people moving along. But you don't want to, throw your foot on the gas, because you're going to lose people that way. And for me, I believe this is true for you, Nikki, and I know it's true for Rochelle. What's more important to me in doing this work is that I impact the people that have the ability to impact the people in the workplace for the better. And that's not going to look the way I do my work and the way Nikki does her work and Rochelle. It all may look different, but I think at the end of the day, if the work that we do matters, particularly for people who look like us, Black and brown people, I want to do work that when I leave, I've changed somebody's mindset, or I've got them to really consider why they need to change their mindset and how that impacts people every day in their workplace.
Agreed. That's it.
I agree. Nikki, what do you think are the biggest obstacles you have right now as an employee attorney?
Well, to be fair, I'm actually not practicing law and haven't for some time. God, Lord knows. Nobody would want that, Rochelle. Believe me. It is not like riding a bike. So I haven't practiced law in a while. I think, but I'll answer the question a little differently. So what I'm facing, I don't know, there are obstacles per se, but I'm still 2022 finding employers who are fairly entrenched, and seeing this work as episodic, kind of bolt on to the
Yes.
work and not integral to it. So, and I think one of my bigger challenges is, quite frankly, trying to determine, as I am building the startup of Harper Slade, how much energy outlay do I want to expend in spaces like that, when I know that there's so many other employers that are assented already to the work, at least in theory, maybe not in practice, but curious enough about it to hear how to be better at it, even if it's incrementally, versus those that are not. So I that's a challenge to me in my work, and quite frankly, it's a challenge to me in my humanity, and how to reconcile even that. I mean, it's hard to do the work, and also it's hard to both be the doctor and the patient, I guess. And sometimes it's hard to reconcile what those messages continue to mean in terms of my own, like, it's like a visceral response as a Black woman, how to respond to this corporate monolith that just is unmoved by the realities that are kind of before us in a fairly acute way. So that's one. And then I think the second challenge, and it's not so much of a challenge when I get to talk about it and explain it, is helping people understand the economic impact of all of this work. So I don't, I've been a long time student of capitalist structures, as I'm sure you all have as well. And I know that capital, as a matter of structure, is not moved by arguments like right thing to do, or even social justice. And to some extent, even just bottom line, like, this is good for our bottom line. Like, so without those, feel kind of ethereal and not really, capital doesn't know what to do with that. That they're just not built to respond to those kinds of arguments and those kinds of premises. But what we all know to be true is that the demography of the country is changing in pretty demonstrable ways. We know that by 2045, minorities will be the majority in the workforce. That also means we must be the majority in the middle class at least. So that's the $60,000 to $120,000 income earner, in order to continue to sustain the sustenance of our middle class. We'll be relying more on Blacker and browner people to do that. That, again, is unprecedented. We have never seen a country where we've relied on this darker citizen to buoy anything of substance. And yet our entire economic footing, and I'm not trying to be melodramatic about it. I mean, this is the reality that's facing us. So we have to find a way to assure that Black and brown, in a very saturated way, are a part of that middle class experience by way of consumption and production. And when we think about the health of the middle class, that helps us understand our taxing infrastructure and our monetary policy theories and our fiscal policy theories and our geopolitical footing and our G7 standing. All of that is reliant on the health of the middle class. And more, we will have to have more Black and brown folks in the middle class in order to make sure that those continue to be viable realities for us. Those middle class jobs happen in the workplace. And the biggest impediment to economic mobility within work is racism and marginalization and muting and stunting and all of the bias that tends to manifest in all systems. I mean, it's not just workplace, but workplaces where I have chosen to toil and to spend my time, because that is where the paycheck is doled out, if you will. So that's where the income is made, and that's what determines whether or not we can find our way into into the middle class strata in meaningful ways. So sometimes having employers understand that argument is like, oh boy, so if you made it, even if you don't get with DEI and you don't even want to understand the principles, you do at some point want to retire, and you want to be able to have leave a world to your children and to yourself even. I mean, this is 23 years from now, where you have sound social security systems, where you have sound economic platforms, where the production rates, consumption rates, where GDP, all those things are super important to the American economy. And you want to be able to help be contributive to a world where that continues to be so. Guess what that means? Black and brown folks got to win too.
Right.
Yeah.
I think also what happens in the workspace is that we're not often represented. So like you said, in 2025,
2045. Yep.
2045, that there's going to be that many more Black and brown people in the workplace, but what roles are they fulfilling? Are they in CEO positions? Are they, board level positions? Are they supervisorial leadership positions to be able to bring on, more diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace to allow them to be able to have this different cultural mindset?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the placement matters. I mean, I'm super interested from my work in the let's see, in the income earning range primarily. Secondarily, I'm super interested in the roles that are attached to that level of income, because theoretically you could, well, not theoretically, you could be an individual contributor without decision making authority per se and still find your way in the middle class, and that's meaningful.
Right.
But the more we become accustomed to exercising and experiencing Black yeses and nos in work that mobilize action and transform policy and reset realities in the way that culture unfolds and is incubated in the workplace, I think we'll find more stickiness and more connection to DEI as a matter of course. But for now, and in the foreseeable future, by and large, we still are and will remain being fairly reliant on white yeses and nos in the workplace and beyond. And so how folks like the three of us ladies are able to connect with those leaders and help shape and mold new norms and new realities around this work is going to be important.
Do you think companies truly buy into DEI as a business strategy? Because you said something earlier that a lot of times the thing that motivates us, or even why we do this work, those feel-good things don't measure up in corporate. We all know that. And even when you tell them this impacts their bottom line, there's still some pushback, even when they know that to be true, because they're still stuck on the emotional side of, well, why do I have to have more people that look like me? That feels like I'm filling quotas in some way. And I've had employers say that to me, that they believe in diversity. They believe diversity should happen, but they stop from actually doing it because it feels very quota driven to them. Have you had clients or potential clients say to you, and how do you overcome this idea that what it is DEI is quota driven and not at the heart of what we do, which is changing minds?
I think that our overall understanding of DEI is fairly infantile and pedestrian.
Yes.
Of course, corporately. And I think even those most sincere, well-intended employers who do see it as a business imperative, even in that instance, what I usually hear them say is like, it is a business imperative, it's a business strategy, because we got to reflect our customers. Or the world is getting, demography is changing. So something just kind of very blank. The way I see it as a strategic imperative, first of all, we have to segment the D, the E, and the I. They are very different doctrines and very different strategies. So with the way that you think about diversity, how we allocate a vision commensurate with furthering diversity, how do we think about resource allocation commensurate with that vision, how do we build individual and organizational capability to help bolster the diversity vision? That's its own resource outlay that could take years for some companies. And then you think about, how do you activate inclusion, activate both how people who are coming into the workplace with a narrative assigned to them that is more deficit rich than not.
Right.
When they're coming into the workplace, what does that mean for how they find a sense of belonging in work? How do they derive what they feel about work and what work feels about them? To me, that's the diversity and inclusion piece.
Right.
Racial equity, whole different beast. I define racial equity as proportional fairness that takes into account the cultural and historic realities that have beset people of color and works to remedy those realities.
Mhm.
So it is both about stopping the bleeding of racism and treating the now infected wound.
Yeah.
So when people talk to me about quotas and about whatever, in some respects, at least in the way that I would define racial equity, it's not entirely inaccurate. So I do think that there should be tremendously focused effort, again, in the racial equity space on the accelerated amplification and activation of people of color at work. So that might feel affirmative action-y, it might feel reparation-y, and it should. And in my mind, that is the intention at this point, because we've missed the equality window, right? There was a time in our country where we could have pursued equality and bolstered a really holistic economic infrastructure for this country that would just continue to rise even as the demography was changing.
Right.
That ship has sailed. Now we have a sense of urgency that's far more acute. We have got to find our way as a country to get Black and brown folks way up higher into the economic echelon. And that's going to take intentional focused action on just this population. So, yep, it does feel set aside and quota-y, and it's intended to, in my opinion. Diversity and inclusion, though, is about how do we think about employee engagement. I want employers to think about employer engagement or employee engagement through the lens of people who are coming in with these calcified narratives that are assigned to them that are so deficit rich and so difficult to fight their way out of. At the same time, they're trying to get their work done. That impacts how we experience the workplace. It impacts how we experience the sense of engagement, and we all covet engagement. Now, this is nomenclature that employers already understand. They don't understand right thing to do or social justice, but they do understand employee engagement, and they do understand that once you have an employee who is engaged, you now have an employee who is more connected to work, who's more interested in the workplace, who can exercise discretionary effort, who is now more innovative. Innovation leads to a more competitive organization. And so now you've got this great advantage. That's why you pursue diversity and inclusion, and you pursue racial equity, in my opinion, at work, because of the economic imperative that's in front of us.
Agreed. I think that's a brilliant answer. And I hope that clears up for a lot of people who do view DEI simply through the lens of quota driven and don't understand that each piece is its own separate piece and its own separate work. And I think because
it has to come in together.
Yeah. And I think because it runs together, you hear DEI, whatever your idea around that is, you just lump that one thing together and you go, this is what it is. And to your point, it is a very infantile understanding of what DEI is. I do agree that there has to be some amplification. I get nervous about it, particularly from a culture perspective, because I see this happen a lot with companies that do this influx of hiring of all of these Black and brown people, but they've done nothing in their culture that welcomes these people in. So you have this influx of hiring where we all show up and that influx of people leaving, because if you haven't dealt with or really dealt with, okay, we want to have more people that don't look like us in the workplace, but how do we cultivate a culture that welcomes these people in? Because if you don't do that, then you just be hiring a bunch of Black and brown people, and then they'll be leaving, and we keep doing this. And so it's important when I talk to clients, it's like, well, let's talk about what kind of culture you have here, because we can do a strategy, and we can connect you with recruitment firms that'll get you all of the demographics you want in this building tomorrow. But they'll probably be gone at the end of their orientation because nobody's done the work to ready themselves to actually be working with diverse candidates, diverse people. We see work differently. We think about work differently. We talk differently. We interact differently. We communicate differently. Do you even understand what diverse people are like? You know what I mean? So I definitely agree that we're past equality at this point. We're well past that. But I definitely want companies to be, if you're going to ramp up for the purpose of equity, to make sure that you're doing that back end work of creating a culture that these people feel welcomed into when you do that.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, I have a course that I offer. It's called The Garden, and it helps people understand. It's like an immersive experience
Mm-hmm.
where you think about the workplace as a garden. And for the most part, America's workplaces in general have been accustomed to growing, let's say, petunias. We have grown petunias at work. We know exactly what petunias need by way of sunlight. We know how to
Mm-hmm.
fertilize the petunia. We know where to put it in the garden so to thrive. Our gardeners have been trained only to grow petunias. They know petunias well. They go home and they're married to petunias. They are in communities with petunias. Petunias are everywhere. And they
Yeah.
were saying, okay, so but diversity says now we need marigolds and we need, I don't know, daisies. I'm just making
Sunflowers.
this up. Right. Okay, all this stuff. And so what we do is we stick all these sunflowers and daisies and sunflowers and daisies inside of the marigold dirt.
Yeah.
And we expect them to flourish. And we're like,
Yeah.
what's wrong with these other flowers?
Exactly.
They need to be put on a performance plan.
Improvement plan. Yes.
They need a mentor, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, all of that stuff, because they're just not performing in the way that I'm accustomed to
Yes.
measuring and expecting performance.
Exactly.
Yeah, the bloom is very different. The needs are very different. Where you need to sit in your sunlight, how you toil,
Yep.
amending the soil. I mean, all that. Anyway, I can just garden metaphor forever. But that's exactly right, Tammy. You're exactly right. It's just, and it's not about fault, and it's not
Right.
about blame. It's not about
Right.
blame. This is the world we've inherited, a world of magnolias. The world was built. This country was built to support the needs of magnolias.
Absolutely.
And not only to not support the others, but in some cases to purposely assure the diminution and the marginalization and the muting, intentionally to ensure that they
Right.
just don't thrive.
Right.
And now, if we approach DEI as kind of a charitable, mercenary type of engagement, then we'll take these poor petunias and we'll stick them in the dirt and see what happens. And I told you they're not right. So I just think that we have to, that's the stuff that's hard to unpack, and it's hard for people to realize because it's not everyone's lived experience. It's our lived experience, the three of us on this, and some of the viewers. But if it's not your everyday experience to have engaged with the realities of what it's like to live in either a darker skin, in the case of racial equity, or in the case of diversity and inclusion, LGBTQ, women, disabled. If you haven't had that experience as a part of your life, you don't understand how very different, how very different it is.
Yeah.
And the language also is very different. I think one of the biggest components is the language that's being used in the workspace. Don't you agree?
I agree. Yeah, especially in this work, language, the definitions matter, language matters, that nomenclature, it really does matter. We do tend to be, I can't say that, I keep saying this over and over again, this deficit narrative that's assigned to so many of us, unbeknownst to us many times. It walks in the room seconds before we do, and we're both sitting in there having to figure out how to navigate this. So yeah, then language absolutely matters.
Absolutely. Kirk Visola, thank you for joining us today. He has a comment here. He says, how do you set boundaries when you see that your culture isn't working at your place of employment? And how do you start the conversation without being difficult?
So I think you got to acknowledge that the conversation is difficult, but you don't have to be. So if you are well-intended and moving conversations forward with your managers, with your leaders, to ask questions. I mean, one of the biggest ways to get people to really think and be introspective and maybe even change their mind on certain belief systems they have is to ask questions on what kind of environment is important to you. What would you like to see? What do you want for the future of this company, for the future of this department? What skills and what lens, what attributes are missing in our ability to be much more robust and much more potent in how we deliver our work, either as a department, in our community. And what do you think would really fill that gap? What assumptions do we tend to make without really recognizing how much they are rooted in assumption and presumption?
And in our subconscious.
Yeah. So
right?
maybe asking those questions could be helpful and advancing those conversations just to try to help to see, because sometimes, people don't know what they don't know.
Yep.
And again, as I said at the outset, this work is so counterculture and it's not intuitive for many of us, for most of us, not intuitive at all. We're asking people to do and be something that they have never done or been before in their life. They haven't seen it in their mama's house. Their grandma didn't talk it out about it and stuff. It's not on TV. It's not in the magazines many of them read, or the newspapers, or the
Yep.
television show. This is just not a part of many of the folks that make these decisions. Just not a part of their ritual or cadence in life.
Right.
So that, I don't know. I don't even know if I answered the person's question. Hope so.
Absolutely. It's interesting. According to the 2021 Gartner Employer EVP survey, 82% of employees, and it goes back to what we're talking about, 82% of employees say it is vital for their organization to see them as a whole person and not just employees. Yet 45% of employees believe their organizations see them this way. So to be fully satisfied with their experience, most employees want to bring their whole selves without adverse repercussions. Why do you believe that is?
So one of the things that I've noticed is that I think we as human beings have a pretty solid anchoring to safety, wanting to feel safe.
Yeah.
Safety oftentimes is derived from how much we are around sameness, familiarity, relatability, predictability. We derive safety from all of that. I think the challenge that we face in community is if we grow up in environments, or incubated in environments where sameness and relatability and predictability and familiarity are always one culture. So I was birthed into this zip code with all of the same familiar, relatable, predictable cadence, ritual, people, thoughts, ideas, beliefs. Then I go to a middle school with the same sameness, predictability, relatability, beliefs, but high school, same, college, same. So I've never left, really. Even if you physically left, you never left the nest of challenged and experiential other difference. It's just never been a part of it. So then you're spat out into the workforce and you're moving up and you're now a manager or something, and somebody like Nikki Lanier shows up as an employee of yours. You don't know what to do with me, because in your world, my idea of sameness and relatability, predictability, familiarity has nothing to do with yours. And yet you are now in a leadership position over me and evaluating your level of comfort with me. And you're de facto uncomfortable with me.
Right.
And with Black folks, what happens with us is that when you grow up like that, like what I just described, you experience, and I'm talking largely about white social norms, white systems of incubating talent, people, systems thinking that's not been interrupted by anything by the time you get to work. When you encounter your experiences with Black people before Nikki are episodic. So you experienced me on TV, you experienced people like me in service roles to you, you've experienced people like me as entertainment to you.
Right.
Or super
Sport
negative
related.
or in jail, or somewhere messing up the English language. I don't know. Doing all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't know.
Messing up the English language.
Right. I know. My mother, I did that from my mother who's watching. She's such a King's must speak King's English. But anyway, so you're just somewhere like you're criminalized, you're demonized. So even unknowingly in the subconscious, what that has taught me, person who's grown up in this very one-dimensional way of living, is that that's what Black people are. And so even that is, even I don't like it, or maybe it's not great, but that's what I know, and that too makes me safe. That kind of Black makes me feel safe. But when you're coming up in here and you got thoughts and opinions and beliefs, and you can speak well, and you're well traveled, and you're well read, and I need you to either be the stereotype that renders me feeling safe and comfortable, or I need to, in my head, subconsciously make you that. So that's when I think you hear a lot of folks of color who are saying, I just don't feel like I can bring my whole self to work. I don't feel like I can do and be my best in the workplace because I continue to be seen
Right.
as something that I'm not. This narrative that's over on top of me that I'm cloaked with speaks
Right.
more loudly than the actual me.
Right.
And it resonates easier with the culture because it's also the more familiar. The narrative of me is
Right.
the more familiar
Right.
to the dominant culture than the actual me.
Right. That reminds me of, there was this debate around Brené Brown book around vulnerability. And she was talking about being vulnerable and how it is a gift. And I do believe it is a gift. However, I find that it's harder for people, particularly Black and brown people, to come into the workplace and actually give any kind of vulnerability because we don't know how that truly is going to impact us at work. And so the dominant culture probably can come into the workplace and be a little bit more vulnerable than maybe Black and brown people, because to your point, we're coming into a dominant culture that may not have experienced my Black, Nikki's Black, Rochelle's Black. So us being vulnerable may not look the same way as, say, Amy's vulnerability, but we are being vulnerable, but you have no context for what my vulnerability looks like in the workplace. So it appears to you that I'm not, even in those moments when I am.
Yes. Yeah. That reminds me of I tell the story often. When I went to school in Miami, went law school at the University of Miami, took the bar, passed it the first time. I was elated, and I went to go visit my grandmother a few weeks after I passed the bar. She was born in in Georgia, grew up, of course, Jim Crow, just the most atrocities as you might imagine, and being in the South and being a young Black woman. And she herself raised 8 girls in Jim Crow. And I went to my grandmother, and she was having one of her tea gatherings with the neighborhood elders, and I was kind of forcing my way through the crowd, and I went to her in her lounge chair, and she held her body up in a very feeble way, and I said, "Grandmama, I passed the bar and I'm going to be a lawyer." And she put her hands on my shoulder and she looked at me in the eyes. She said, "Do not go in there and upset any white folks." And that stays with me. That narrative stays with me in more ways than I probably care to admit.
Yeah.
Totally get where she was coming from, because in her day, clearly, upsetting white people could cost you your life.
Absolutely.
However, in our day, the same could still cost you your life, and it could cost you your job. It costs you your livelihood. I mean, there's a cost,
and your mental health.
There's a cost to that I think is real and unabiding and unyielding. And so I know for me, as a matter of fact, it has definitely prevented my comfort level with being more vulnerable in work in the past. I mean, maybe not as much now. I mean, I'm 52 years old. I'm just getting to the point where I got to do it, or else my head is going to pop off. I got to just be more authentic. But I think
coming as your true self. Yeah.
Right. There's me being vulnerable. So I think, so over the years, I've gotten better at that. But listen, there's a reality that is unshakable. And even if your grandmothers or family members didn't say that to you expressly, as a person of color, particularly a descendant of slaves, there's something that we all know that's been passed to us in utero. That affirms that very statement. And it colors, no pun intended, the way you experience really everything, not just the workplace.
Right. No, I agree. Because there was a debate around that book, and I was just like, I love Brené Brown, but I think we have to be careful about how we tell people to show up in the workplace, because the way I show up, the way you show up, and the way, my girlfriend Lori shows up is too different. And the responses to how we show up is going to be different. And I think we want people to be that, but to my point earlier, we need to create the soil in a culture that is ready to accept these different people being vulnerable in very, very different ways.
Agreed. Agreed.
Michelle Simon, thank you so much. Or Simon, I apologize if I mispronounce your name. She said something very interesting. She has a couple of questions, actually. She said, how do you address the intersection of sexism and racism at work? What role can white women play who want to support all women at work?
So let me start with the latter. Supporting women at work is just that. So how you define support in any aspect of your life is definitely how you should define support, especially in the workplace, perhaps even in a more amplified way. So support must be in action. It must be an active verb. And there has to be some advocacy that is kind of laced throughout the way that support shows up. It is, I think we've had a long standing history of the tension between women's suffrage, the women's movement, and Black women and the nuances and the idiosyncrasies that are associated with uniquely the way that we have experienced life and work. I think us talking about that and trying to dismantle, being real about those tensions, actually calling them out and putting them on the table, but finding ways to establish common ground. I'm in an organization called Walk and War. It's women of color and white women against racism.
Nice.
And it's founded here in Louisville, Kentucky by an amazing friend of mine. Her name is Tawana Bain. She's incredible. But this group is growing in interest and acuity. And I think it's because we have a group of Black women who are intentionally, with a regular cadence, educating white women about our own struggles, the uniqueness of our struggles, in addition to the realities that we have as just women trying to figure all of this out. And how do we, using our own very beautiful and potent, unique voice, lens, and perspectives, activate where we sit, access that we have, audiences that we could get, white women, shouldn't say we, audiences that white women can get, perspectives that white women have, presumptions that white women get that we don't. How do we help them leverage that in order to assure that me as her sister, can get in that room? And so we talk about that. We spend a lot of time talking about that and learning about each other's rituals and traditions and heritage, and we spend time reading together. And we had a social event a couple of weeks ago where we went out and taught a whole bunch of white women how to play spades, like the way we play.
Teach me,
Tammy. You don't know how to play, girl. Now see, the stereotype. I have to cut this short.
I saw that coming, Nikki, because I don't know how to play spades either.
All right, both y'all. After this is over, we're gonna do a quick little tutorial. So we talk about how we play spades, and white women love to play hearts, and we learned. I'd never played hearts, so we did that, and so it was just really cool. Anyway, I'd love to talk to any of your viewers or either you about starting a Walk and War chapter in your fair city, because we're growing, and that's the kind of work that I think white women could really help mobilize themselves around and get this work
into doing that.
Yeah, me too. And I'm
starting a chapter here, because I have so many great white women friends in my life, and I will say in the workplace, I've had white women sometimes show up for me in ways that initially makes you a little bit suspect, especially if you're not used to it. You're trying to think, okay, what's going on here? But I do think it's a great thing to do, for sure.
Absolutely. And being in South Florida myself, that chapter would be welcomed here, considering this is where you graduated from.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Okay, we'll get on the horn a little bit after this and get that going.
Yeah, absolutely. We're reaching at the Diversity Connects top of the hour. Tammy, did you have one last question?
I had one last question for Nikki. I know that you're not practicing law, but this is a question I think is a good one for people watching, whether you're, whatever your race is when HR is content on not addressing wrongdoing in the workplace to the point of letting those people go, how should employees navigate that?
Okay, wait. Now, when you say letting them go, you mean
if there's wrongdoing in the workplace and the person that's done the wrongdoing, HR is insistent that this person is not going to be reprimanded in any way. How do you help employees? How should employees navigate that space? for example, if I'm a woman that's experienced sexual harassment in the workplace and it's come at the hand of um, a male boss, but let's just say that male boss is in leadership, and we know how this works in HR spaces. Depending on where you sit on the food chain is going to depend on what happens here. How should employees navigate that space if HR is going to come back and say, well, we didn't find any wrongdoing in this case at all. So nobody gets reprimanded. Nobody's going to let go. Aside from you packing up your desk and leaving for the day, how else should employee navigate those situations in the workplace?
They shouldn't. They should leave. And here's why.
Mm-hmm.
Your time, your talent, your intellect, your energy all have expiration dates. We will not carry any of those into our elder years.
Mm-hmm.
Elder years. At some
Mm-hmm.
point, they start dwindling. That is your currency.
Yeah.
And for a lot of us, most of us, it's also the means by which we derive peace and a sense of belonging and purpose. In the wrong hands, in the wrong work environment, and with the wrong HR construct and immature HR organizations, all of that could be eviscerated.
Right.
There are too many employers out here, too many organizations out here that are not what you just described. Go find one and align yourself to it.
I love that answer. Because I think it's so spot on. I think we waste so much time, and it's the one thing we don't have. We can never get it back. Once it's gone, it's gone. And I think once that age-old saying, Maya Angelou, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. The first time your organization demonstrates to you what is important to them, that the values that they have on their wall is not the values they actually live, then you have to make a different decision for yourself in your career. And I would tell people the same thing. Start planning your exit strategy.
Right.
Start looking for other jobs in other ways. Now, depending on gross misconduct, you can take legal action depending on what it is. But just bad HR practices, bad HR people, start making your exit out of that, because you can't get that time back. And peace is at a premium. Pay the premium cost for peace.
Absolutely. Where I think also, and I mentioned this to another guest of mine who was on the podcast, it's really aligning, and you have to go back a little bit. It's aligning your values, your own personal values first, with alignment to the company or the organization which you want to work with. So the questions that you bring to the table will often let you know if their values are aligned with yours.
Yeah, and you also don't want to spend time with regularity, like with routine cadence, justifying, explaining, defending, and protecting in work. Justifying, defending, explaining your right to be there, your value, your humanity, and then defending yourself from your employer. It's the most depleting exercise of human will. Like in terms of how much willingness you have to give to that, how much skill you have to develop in order to get good at it, how adept you have to be at learning how to navigate work versus just doing your work. And I mean, call me Pollyanna, but there's a place. There are too many places where you can just go and do the work and leave. Come to work with your dignity intact. Leave work with your dignity intact. That's not too tall of an order. And if it's too much disruption, listen, we got bad days. Folks go off on folks sometimes, right? So this is the episodic thing is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the cultural.
Yeah.
This is a matter of culture. And when you bring it to attention to culture, there is this, like a proverbial shoulder shrug. Then that's just not the place for you.
Great.
Absolutely. Ladies, this conversation has been illuminating. Please reach out to Tammy Triolo and Nikki Lanier on their LinkedIn pages if you have any comments or questions. Their information will be in the comments. We hope to see you on Thursday. We usually air on Tuesday. However, we have a special guest, Julie Turney. She helps out burnt out and frustrated HR professionals control their careers. Ladies, it's been such a blessing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.